The duty officer at the Air Defense Coordination Cell south of Voronezh logged the first inbound track at 23 minutes past 1 in the morning. By the time he reached for the secure handset to escalate, he had 17 tracks. 90 seconds after that, he had 41. He never made the call, not because he was incapacitated, but because the decision tree he had been trained to follow assumed that a saturation event of this magnitude was something his sector would warn about, not something his sector would discover. He was looking at a threat picture his own doctrine treated as the responsibility of someone further up the chain, and somewhere further up the chain, 3 other officers were having the same realization at the same moment. The strike was already inside the system before any single human being in the Russian defensive architecture understood that it had begun. This is not a story about how many drones Ukraine launched that night. The number will be debated for years, and most of the figures you will see are wrong. This is a story about what happens when a defensive network designed around a particular shape of threat encounters a threat that has changed shape, and about why the fires that followed at the fuel depots were not the consequence of the attack, but the confirmation of something that had failed days earlier. I have spent a long time studying air defense systems and the men who operate them, and I want to be direct with you about something at the start. The Russian integrated air defense covering the western military districts is not a poorly designed system. It is, in many respects, a sophisticated one. The reason it failed on this night was not that its hardware was inadequate. The reason it failed was that the assumptions baked into its design had quietly stopped describing the battlefield it was actually defending. Let me describe those assumptions because they matter more than any technical detail of the engagement that followed. The Russian air defense concept, covering the strategic depth behind the front, had been built around a threat model that prioritized 3 things: high-value, low-volume incoming systems, meaning cruise missiles and ballistic threats arriving in modest numbers along predictable corridors. A finite number of attack vectors, meaning the doctrine assumed the attacker would be constrained by the cost and complexity of generating mass. And a defensive economy in which each interceptor was understood to be valuable and each target was understood to justify the expenditure. Under those assumptions, the architecture was rational. Radar coverage was layered. Interceptor batteries were positioned to cover the corridors the threat was expected to use. Command relationships were structured to allow individual battery commanders meaningful autonomy within a coordinated picture. The system had been exercised against the threat it was designed for, and inside that exercise, it performed acceptably. The problem is that the threat had stopped behaving the way the system assumed it would, and nobody at the operational level had rewritten the defensive concept to reflect what was actually arriving over the border now. By the autumn of this campaign, Ukraine was producing long-range strike drones at a rate and a unit cost that had collapsed every assumption underneath the original Russian defensive model. The systems were not high value. They were cheap enough that losing dozens of them in a single night was operationally acceptable to the attacker. They were not low volume. They could be launched in waves that the doctrine had never contemplated absorbing. And they did not arrive along predictable corridors. They arrived along whatever corridors the geography allowed, often at altitudes and speeds that placed them in the awkward seam between what fighter aviation could efficiently engage and what surface-to-air systems were optimized to track. The defensive architecture had been built for a duel. The threat had become a flood. I want you to understand what this does to a defensive system because it is more subtle than simply being overwhelmed. A duel-optimized air defense does not fail gracefully when it encounters a flood. It fails in a specific pattern, and that pattern is what we saw unfold on this night. The first thing that breaks under saturation is not the radar coverage. It is the decision economy. Every air defense system, regardless of how automated, depends on a sequence of human and procedural decisions that consume time. Track identification, classification, threat prioritization, engagement authorization, weapon assignment, post-engagement assessment. Inside a duel-optimized concept, these decisions are paced. The operator has time to consider each track because the tracks are arriving at a rate the procedure assumed. Inside a saturation event, the decisions stack. The procedure was not written to be executed at the rate the situation demands, and the moment the procedure falls behind the inbound timeline, every subsequent decision is being made on degraded information about a threat picture that has already moved on. The system does not stop working, it works in the past tense. The operators are engaging tracks that no longer represent the leading edge of the threat, while the leading edge of the threat continues deeper into the defensive depth uncontested. This is what the duty officer south of Voronezh was looking at when he reached for the handset and did not complete the call. He was not paralyzed. He was correctly assessing that his procedure could not be applied at the rate the situation required, and he was searching for an authority above him to provide a different procedure. That authority was searching upward for the same reason. The decision economy of the entire Western air defense network was collapsing toward a single point of clarity that did not exist, because no one in the chain had been given the authority to declare that the procedure itself was inadequate to the moment. The second thing that breaks under saturation is the discrimination logic. Every modern air defense system relies on the ability to distinguish between threats that justify interceptor expenditure and threats that do not. Decoys, debris, civilian aviation, friendly air traffic, electronic ghosts, and genuine inbound weapons all populate the same radar picture, and the discrimination algorithms, supported by human judgment, are what keep the system from exhausting itself on the wrong targets. When the volume of genuine inbound threats rises sharply, two failures occur in parallel. The discrimination process slows because operators are checking more tracks against more references in less time per track. And the threshold for engagement drops because the cost of letting a real threat through has become higher than the cost of engaging something that turns out to be a decoy. The result is interceptor expenditure against the wrong targets at exactly the moment when interceptor inventory is the variable that matters most. Ukraine had built its strike package with this failure pattern in mind. The wave that crossed into Russian airspace that night was not homogeneous. It included long-range strike drones carrying meaningful warheads, decoy systems designed to mimic the radar signature of the strike systems without carrying any payload at all, and a smaller number of higher-end systems whose mission was to exploit the gaps that the saturation would open. The defensive network was being asked to discriminate between three threat types in real time under decision economy collapse against an inbound count that was rising faster than the operators could process. The arithmetic was not survivable. And then the third thing broke, which was the engagement coverage itself. Russian air defense batteries, protecting the strategic depth, had been positioned according to the original threat model, which meant that their fields of fire were oriented along the corridors the doctrine expected the threat to use. When the Ukrainian strike package distributed its inbound vectors across a frontage wider than the original threat model anticipated, individual batteries found themselves engaging tracks at the edges of their effective coverage rather than at the center. Engagement effectiveness drops sharply at the edges of a battery's envelope. The hit probability per interceptor fired declines, the time available for re-engagement shrinks, and the geometry begins to favor the inbound system over the defender. Across the network, batteries were now expending interceptors at rates the inventory could not sustain. Against targets, they were engaging from suboptimal angles, while the discrimination logic was misallocating the engagements they did achieve. This is the operational picture inside which the fuel depots began to explode. I want to slow down here because the fires at the depots are the part of this story the public will remember, and the public memory will frame them as the dramatic climax of the engagement. That framing is incomplete. The fires were not the climax, they were the receipt. By the time the first depot at Bryansk took its initial strike at roughly 2 in the morning, the defensive failure had already occurred. The fires were the visible confirmation of an invisible collapse that had taken place over the preceding 90 minutes in the decision cells, the radar pictures, and the interceptor inventories of the Russian air defense network. Understanding this sequence is what separates serious analysis from spectacle. The depot at Bryansk was struck first because its geography placed it at the seam between two defensive sectors whose coordination had degraded earliest in the engagement. The strikes that reached it were not the leading edge of the wave. They were the systems that had been routed specifically to exploit the seam, which Ukrainian planners had identified through pattern analysis conducted over weeks of probing strikes that the Russian command had treated as nuisance attacks rather than as reconnaissance. Every nuisance strike in the preceding weeks had been mapped. Every defensive response had been timed. The seam between the sectors had been documented, and the strike package for this night had been built to drive a meaningful number of systems through that seam at the exact moment the broader saturation event was consuming the attention of both sector commands. When the depot ignited, the secondary effects propagated faster than the response protocols could contain them. A fuel depot of that scale does not burn the way a single tank burns. It cascades. Storage cells communicate through shared infrastructure, ventilation systems carry ignition between containment areas, and the firefighting response is constrained by the same proximity that makes the depot useful in the first place. Within 40 minutes of the initial strike, the depot was no longer a logistical asset. It was a thermal event that emergency services were attempting to limit rather than extinguish. And while that thermal event was consuming the attention of the regional response, the second wave was already passing over it toward the depots at Oryol and Smolensk. The targeting logic across the depots deserves attention because it reveals something about how Ukraine was thinking about this entire operation. The depots were not selected for their size. They were selected for their position inside the Russian sustainment network. Each one was a node whose function could not be quickly replicated by alternative routing. Bryansk supported southern axis logistics. Oryol fed the central front. Smolensk anchored the northern sustainment corridor. Striking any one of them would have been a meaningful operational achievement. Striking all three in a single night, while simultaneously consuming the attention of the air defense network through saturation, produced a sustainment shock that would propagate through the Russian operational posture for weeks. The fires were tactical events. The cumulative effect was strategic. Now, I want to give the Russian response its due, because the men inside that defensive network were not passive. Once the scale of the engagement became apparent at the command level, which happened somewhere around the 90-minute mark, the response was tactically coherent. Fighter aviation was scrambled to engage inbound systems that had penetrated the surface-to-air envelope. Electronic warfare assets were activated to attempt control link disruption against the drones still in flight. Reserve interceptor inventory was authorized for release to batteries that had expended their immediate stocks. Civil defense protocols were initiated in the threatened regions. None of these responses were incompetent. They were the actions a professional air defense network is supposed to take when the scale of the threat exceeds the initial defensive posture. The problem was that every one of those responses had been designed to address a defensive shortfall, not a defensive collapse. Scrambled fighter aviation could engage individual drones, but the volume of inbound systems exceeded what fighter sorties could process in the available window. Electronic warfare disruption of control links worked against drones that depended on continuous control, but a significant portion of the Ukrainian strike package was operating on pre-programmed routing with terminal guidance that did not require continuous external input. Reserve interceptor release helped depleted batteries, but reserve interceptors did not solve the discrimination failure that had caused the depletion in the first place. The Russian response was treating symptoms of a collapse whose underlying cause was the inadequacy of the defensive concept itself, not the inadequacy of any single element executing that concept. This is the doctrinal lesson I want serious students to extract from this engagement, and it is more important than the question of how many drones got through. Air defense effectiveness is no longer determined primarily by the quality of individual interceptor systems or the skill of individual battery commanders. It is determined by two things that must work together: decision tempo and inventory economics. Remove decision tempo and the inventory becomes irrelevant because you cannot allocate it fast enough to matter. Remove favorable inventory economics, and the decision tempo becomes irrelevant because you run out of interceptors before you run out of threats. The Russian network on this night had been built around the assumption that both of those variables would remain inside the envelope its original concept had defined. The Ukrainian strike package had been built to push both of them outside that envelope simultaneously. Once they were outside it, no individual battery, no individual operator, no individual aircraft could compensate. The failure was systemic, and it had been guaranteed by the design choices made long before the first track appeared on the screen. The cruel geometry the Russian air defense commanders faced that night is worth naming clearly. Expend interceptors at the rate the inbound volume required, and exhaust the inventory before dawn. Conserve interceptors against the possibility of a second wave, and allow the current wave to reach its targets. Neither option restored the variable that had already been surrendered, which was the assumption that the threat would arrive at a volume the inventory was sized for. Whatever choice was made would be the wrong one. The battery commanders who expended their stocks aggressively watched the depots burn anyway. The battery commanders who conserved their stocks watched the depots burn and were then unable to engage the follow-on systems with the inventory they had preserved. There was no correct answer inside the framework the doctrine provided. By the time the sun came up, the strategic picture had shifted in ways that no Russian press release that morning attempted to address. 3 fuel depots were no longer operational. The interceptor inventory across the Western air defense network had been expended at rates that would require weeks to replenish from production and stockpile sources that were already under strain from other commitments. The decision economy of the defensive network had been demonstrated in front of every officer who had been awake that night to be inadequate to the threat it was actually facing. And, most consequentially, the psychological premise that the strategic depth behind the front was defensible against the current Ukrainian capability had been disproved in a manner that could not be quietly walked back. The next time a wave of this scale crossed the border, every operator at every console would be working under the knowledge that the network had failed once already, and that knowledge would shape every decision they made. The deeper assumption that died that night was the one underneath everything else, and it deserves to be stated plainly because it applies far beyond this single engagement. The assumption was that defensive depth, measured in kilometers of airspace and layers of interceptors, equates to defensive resilience. It does not. Defensive depth is meaningful only when the decision architecture inside that depth can operate at the tempo the threat imposes. A network with 1,000 kilometers of layered coverage and a decision economy that collapses at 40 inbound tracks per minute is, in practical terms, a network whose effective depth is whatever the inbound tracks per minute permits its operators to process. Ukraine had not penetrated 1,000 kilometers of defensive depth. It had penetrated the decision tempo, and the depth had followed. The depots are still burning in some of the imagery from later that morning, and the Russian repair crews are doing the work that repair crews do after engagements like this one. The interceptor batteries are receiving resupply along corridors that are themselves now identified as targets for whatever comes next. The officers who were on duty that night are writing reports whose conclusions will be filtered through several layers of institutional preference before reaching the levels where the conclusions might actually matter. And somewhere in the Ukrainian planning cells, the analysts who designed this strike package are already studying the Russian response in detail, because every defensive action taken during the engagement revealed something about how the network thinks, and that something will be useful the next time. The question I am left with, the question every air defense officer in every military watching this campaign should be asking himself this morning, is not whether his own network could handle the volume Ukraine generated that night. The question is whether his network's decision economy has been tested against any volume at all, recently enough to mean anything. When was the procedure last rewritten? When was the discrimination logic last challenged by a serious adversary? And if the threat his network was designed to defeat has quietly stopped being the threat his network is actually facing, would the first sign of that gap be a log entry from a duty officer who reached for the handset and did not complete the call.